Thank you. I'm very happy to be here for the invitation to speak. In many ways, an event like this is very rare, I think, in the human rights sector in Northern Ireland, and actually moves against the kind of fragmentation that some of the other earlier speakers mentioned. I have been involved, I suppose, in this idea of putting people at the heart of human rights. I've been involved in trying to get disabled people at the heart of monitoring and reporting on the Convention since about 2007. And for the last 6 or 7 years in particular, I was made partly in Northern Ireland, but also for the last 6 or 7 years, I provided pro bono support to do 2 different coalitions of disabled people's organisations in England who are trying to prepare themselves and engage in a process to produce a shadow report into the committee, do the kind of work basically that John Paul was just outlining. And what I've done is I've reflected on the real practical problems, because I don't think that's been a success. I certainly don't feel myself that my own efforts have paid fruit in the main. So I find that when I was trying to prepare this presentation, I thought about, well, what actually have been the sources of the problems which have led to a lack of inclusion or a lack of centrality for disabled people in this process as the UK now is coming up for examination by the UN Committee. Just by way of a wee bit of context, that from a quick read of the preparatory materials for the CRPD, this treaty body kind of monitoring process actually was a very late addition in the negotiations. For a long time the plan was to have an international committee, certainly, but it would be a committee of experts who would be there to provide advice and guidance to states on implementing the Convention. And combined then with a strong creation, which is unique, of national level monitoring mechanisms, which relates to the commissions, and particularly the role of the Equality and Human Rights Commissions that we heard about earlier. And it was only late on that this traditional, states submit a report, the committee examines the report, the state says we're doing great, the NGOs say you're doing terrible, and the committee is somehow, never having heard of Northern Ireland before that particular session, has to make sense of who's right and who's wrong in what respect. But there's a sort of, at best you could say there was a conservatism which led to a continuationist approach, or you could say somewhat cynically, states know this doesn't work, it doesn't actually generate that much pressure on them compared to the effort that NGOs put into the process, so it's a bit of a red herring in a way. So there was potential there are new approaches to monitoring in the CRPD, but there was potential for a much more radical approach which wasn't actually pursued in the end. So I was trying to reflect on the sources or problems. Now, I never intentionally try to insult everybody in the room, although I have been known to do it. I came up with a list of kind of sources of problems. And if you don't recognise your organisation or your role here, I apologise, that's probably an inadvertent omission. And these are by no means exclusive categories. Obviously, you can be an independent expert and also work in the human rights sector and be an academic, to speak about myself, for example, as to how I currently fit into this list. So these are, where have the problems come from? Because the text of the Convention itself, which is the first thing I'm going to talk about, actually is quite strong in terms of inclusion and participation of disabled people themselves, but in practice that potential hasn't been realised. So in the main I'm going to talk about how at international level interpretations of the Convention, even when you have what looks like a good text, interpretations can create problems, and then run through more quickly, just in the time that I've got, about how these different sectors have been involved in creating problems. There's still a lack of clarity around whose human rights are actually being reported on or being examined. And Brona spoke about this, and I very much agree with her views. Problem of a definition of a disabled person. And then it follows from that, well, who are you trying to include in the reporting process? That's not clear either. And particularly then this phrase which occurs several times in the Convention, representative organisations for disabled people. What does that mean? And the way that's been interpreted has arguably weakened these processes of inclusion too. The definition, again, Brona gave that earlier, so I won't kind of read it out again. Again, as pointed earlier, the committee has criticised the process, so any suspicion Brona and I conspired in any way is entirely justified. The committee has criticised approaches based on impairments and stressed the need for states to focus on barriers faced by disabled people. However, the committee at the same time, in its concluding observations, first off, in its general comment, first of all, it says the committee reaffirms that a person's status as a person with a disability or the existence of an impairment must never be used as grounds for denying legal capacity. Now, this is at best a radical extension of the scope of the Convention. it doesn't just apply to people with disabilities, it also applies to people with impairments, which means it applies to me, which is a nonsense, quite frankly. So although the committee's advising states in one way on terms of the definition of the meaning of the definition of disability in the Convention, in other respects, it's actually using a much broader definition which moves away from the social model approach of Article 1 of the Convention. So there's a lack of clarity coming from the committee itself as to who a person with disability actually is and whose rights the Convention are actually protecting. And that's also been reflected in concluding observations. It is concerned at the risk of exclusion of persons who should be protected by the Convention, in particular persons with psychosocial disabilities, mental illness. Now, a lot of my colleagues, grassroots disabled rights activists in England, actually despise the term psychosocial disability because if ever there was a term which departs from the social model of disability, it's that term psychosocial. And again, they don't think that anybody is a disabled person because of a mental illness, no matter how profound. It's a combination of mental illness and barriers which are imposed on that person by society is what creates disability. So again, you can see here how the committee isn't being consistent in its own message as to who actually this convention is trying to protect. There's a general obligation that state parties shall closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities, including children with disabilities, and of course that bit's completely forgotten about in the Convention by and large, through their representative organisations. The main body of the Convention itself in Article 33.3 says, civil society, in particular persons with disabilities, and their representative organisations shall be involved and participate fully in the monitoring process. So it's persons with disability and their organisations. Again, representative organisations. Now, in its concluding observations, the committee has been consistently calling for greater inclusion of such organisations in the work of monitoring and reporting. And in its guidelines on participation in the work of the committee, it's provided a bit of clarification as to who or what its understanding is by this. Now, quite often there's a complete slip from the term in the text of the Convention, which is representative organisations, to the phrase disabled people's organisations. Now, the committee understands disabled people's organisations to be those comprised by a majority of persons with disabilities, at least half of its membership, governed, led and directed by persons with disabilities. Now, in many ways, this is an extremely weak idea of what a representative organisation could be. If we think of this as a definition of a representative organisation for women, for example, we can see the problems. If at least half of an organisation was women, I don't think any of us would accept that as an acceptable organisation to represent women. Certainly, in my experience in the women's sector in Northern Ireland, that wouldn't be acceptable. It's also in no sense what a disabled people's organisation means to my colleagues in disabled people's organisations in England. Now, it is possible to have an alternative interpretation. As I say, I think this is very weak because this means the state obligation to include people with disabilities through their representative organisations could be an organisation where, for example, half the staff aren't people with disabilities and that half the staff are all the managers, senior managers and chief executive. So it's quite weak. Based on the principles and the general obligations in the text of the Convention, an alternative interpretation would be representative organisations would be those whose membership consists solely of disabled people, and it's an organisation completely controlled by disabled people at board level, staffed only by disabled people, and working for disabled people wholly in accordance with a social model of disability. Now, organisations like this don't, in my experience at least, exist in Northern Ireland, but they certainly do exist in England. Organisations where you can get all the staff from 3 or 4 organisations together in the room, and there will not be a person in the room who is not a person with a disability. So the committee itself has put forward guidance which actually substantively weakens what this obligation means. And in many ways, this obligation is key to unlocking things for disabled people. Academics, boo hiss. There's a real risk of power and knowledge being used without engagement with people with disabilities. There are lots of human rights academics justifiably interested in the area, doing good work in the area. But knowledge is power and expertise is power, and that can, in lots of implicit ways even, can disempower people with disabilities in their engagement with human rights processes. There's a risk of research agendas not being informed by the human rights concerns of disabled people themselves. And there's a risk of the extensive resources available to academics of drowning the voice of disabled people themselves. And I say that as a sort of academic myself, of course. The human rights sector has all the same issues as academics, but also, the human rights sector produces inaccessible material on human rights. Basically, the human rights sector reproduces poor human rights practice for disabled people. When they do produce materials which are accessible, they tend to be only materials that they think are relate to the CRPD. They don't think about the material respecting other human rights conventions need to be accessible in just the same way, just for the same reason. The human rights sector can compete for funding directly with disabled people's organisations. And the use of their expertise can be used to say representative organisations don't have the expertise, therefore they should be excluded. And that's something I've explicitly encountered. People saying we can't trust the disabled people's organisations to report on their own experience of human rights violations because they don't have the expertise, without any effort historically having been made to support them to build their capacity to have that expertise themselves. And also, there's an issue that the human rights sector has quite often functions with a very narrow interpretation of Article 33.2, which Colin and Paul referred to earlier. Okay. This requires a framework, and this is part of the novelty in terms of inclusion within the CRPD. A framework including one or more independent mechanisms. Now, at the international level, probably driven by the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, that's tended to be interpreted as a framework of one or more independent mechanisms. So basically the convention had the potential to create a new public space, a new public sphere within human rights, a new international public sphere, specifically designed to ensure the inclusion of disabled people in those human rights processes. But the interpretation which sees this obligation as being delivered simply by the creation of an independent mechanism, basically a national human rights institution, means that the potential of this has been lost. So independent experts, there's issues about independence of experts, and by independent experts I include the members of the committee. Disability charities, same issues again as academics and human rights. Greater resources used to gain control. A token engagement with people, what colleagues in England would call rent-a-crip, where there's an engagement with a very small number of disabled people who are just kind of presented for photo opportunities. And also for many disabled people, disability charities remain key perpetrators of human rights, but people are forced to see disability charities supposedly taking the lead in the protection of their human rights. The committee, if it's been told that currently the committee has 17 to 18 members, the committee doesn't have to be made up of disabled people, but in practice, that is what's become. It'd be interesting to think of the Committee on the Rights of the Child actually being made up of children. Now, again, it's good, obviously good consideration. It doesn't mean that it had to be, but in practice it has become the case, and I think will continue to be the case, that all members of the committee will have lived experience of disability. But again, it had to be there to drive that. Disabled people themselves have struggled in many ways. There's politics involved, there's career disabled people involved, where people are positioning for themselves and an individual through these kind of avenues. And when people are excluded other areas of social and political participation, it's a very easy route to follow. There's a lack of pan-disability perspective, which the committee has struggled with. And again, I think that's partly what's laid behind some of the difficulties the committee's had getting going. This participation in the negotiations is a double-edged sword. The more people participate in the negotiations, the more a compromise document you will end up with. And in some respects, the text of the CRPD doesn't serve disabled people well because it's been too vague. And also, disabled people feel almost that it's there, they feel too great a sense of ownership of it. And that has led to kind of quite fruitless lobbying strategies in terms of state parties. At the end of the day, it's an agreement between states. And the role of states in deciding what the convention means is really, when it comes down to it, is overwhelming. And there's been a lack of that kind of recognition of the different role with respect to the treaty that NGOs have or representative organisations have. And the text as well, I think, has suffered from the more parties there are in the negotiations, the more problems you can have. There's also a problem here in that there can be a commitment to inclusion which is actually destructive. That personal experience of profound human rights violations doesn't always support a balanced or nuanced or a genuinely inclusive approach, because you can be overwhelmed by your personal experience, which can be very profound human rights violations of the worst kind. And it's very hard to step beyond that into a general perspective. If you're somebody who's been imprisoned and subject to compulsory treatment because of your mental health issues, it's very hard to actually find genuine substantive common cause with someone who's deaf. Because that pan-disability perspective, which is necessary for the convention to work, actually isn't there yet. And the committee itself has struggled in developing that pan-disability perspective. So, in spite of all that, just to finish off, the representative organisations in the UK have achieved success, but not so much at the monitoring level. There were initially about 36 reservations being considered. Those were reduced to 6 in the end. It was the disabled people's organisations who achieved that. It was the disabled people's organisations who achieved the ratification of the optional protocol. And they have engaged extensively around with disabled people in large numbers, like in the thousands, in producing shadow reports. But they haven't actually been able to get those reports over the line, partly because of the problems with the committee giving them a deadline that actually vanished, and they kind of burnt up all the resources in doing that. So the biggest problem is including people with disabilities in monitoring the convention requires the convention itself to be delivered on. There's a vicious circle here, because unless the substantive rights of the convention are delivered on to a greater extent than they currently are, there will never really be the kind of inclusion in the work of the convention that the convention itself realises. There's a vicious circle here which is going to be very hard to break and have this convention become real for people. Thank you.